We've been talking about low emission solutions and many of the technologies and the systems that can bring the world's energy system and the world's land use patterns to sustainability. In this module, I want to talk about public policy aspects of this transition. What is it that the government should do using the tools at hand of government, whether it's taxation or regulation or other kinds of payments or public financing of infrastructure, public procurement of vehicles, for example, building codes, zoning laws, liability rules, the whole gamut of public policy tools that governments have in order to help move a largely market based system, but a mixed economy that includes both public and private and not for profit parts of our economy to the low emissions solutions that are the feature of this entire course. In the first chapter of this module, I'd like to talk about general policy principles. Let me please go through 12 overall principles that I believe will guide the transformation, whether at the local or national level or at the global level, so that the world as a whole over the coming decades adopts the low emission solutions and moves to zero net greenhouse gas emissions sometime around the middle of the century. The first key principle, I believe, is that we need to have a vision of where we're going. The Paris Climate Agreement gives us the goals, in essence, to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius in global warming, to pursue efforts to stay below 1.5 degrees C. And in Article 4, especially paragraph 19, governments are called upon to have a mid century development strategy consistent with low emissions. I believe that this is the first principle for success is put our eyes on the horizon, where we expect to be mid-century, where we need to be in terms of emissions reductions. Think hard in every national context how to get there. Understand how each region's specific geography. Are you in a mountain zone where hydroelectric power may be plentiful? Or in a desert or semi desert where solar energy might be at large scale and low cost? Or along seismic fault lines, for instance, in the meeting of the plates in the mid Atlantic, where Iceland is thereby able to tap massive amounts of geothermal energy. What is your geography? What is the natural availability of renewable energy sources, wind or solar power, hydroelectric power, or ocean energy that can be tapped through ingenious new technologies? The second principle that I would emphasize is that this is a long term transformation that needs to extend consistently and persistently beyond the life of any individual government. Governments often are governed by their election cycles, but energy policy has to be at the scale of generations, 20 or 40-year intervals, thinking ahead again to mid century. And I think that this will require our governments to take many of the considerations of energy policy outside of the normal day to day politics or the electoral cycle politics and to create new institutions that can take a longer term view. The United Kingdom has done this, for example, in creating new institutions that say to any government, and this is supported by all parties, take the long view, be monitored how you're doing, be evaluated independently. This cannot be solved on the basis of short term politics. We've done this in other political institutions, for example, in our central banks, where we've given the central banks a degree of operational independence, even though still within democratic oversight. And I believe that that is a second key principle for this transformation. Create political institutions with the long term perspective and with the independence to get this job done beyond the election cycle. The third principle, and I think it's quite obvious, it's the theme of the entire course, is the deployment of the low carbon technologies. We know that there are multiple choices that are going to compete with each other for performance specifications, for cost considerations, for deployment in particular niches of the economy. But of course, I'm thinking of wind and solar power, of hydroelectric power, of nuclear energy, which is going to play a significant role in a low carbon world energy future, of carbon capture, reuse, and storage, or sometimes CCUS, where the carbon is used, for instance, to make synthetic fuels after being captured, or stored, the S part, in geologic formations where carbon dioxide can be put safely away for the long term. Of course, electric vehicles and new modes of public transport, sharing of vehicles through the new sharing services, which will allow for much more efficient use of the physical capital that goes into making our vehicles. Electric heating, cooling, and ventilation of buildings will be another way to economize on the direct use of fossil fuels in the boilers and furnaces of our residences or our commercial structures. So, the third obvious principle for the low emissions uh, solutions is to deploy low emissions technologies. I've mentioned several of them for carbon, but we have comparable solution needs for methane, for nitrous oxide, and for the other industrial greenhouse gases. The fourth principle that I would say is that governments need to deploy a range of tools. I've been in public policy analysis and practice for decades, and often there are huge debates. Should we have a price signal, or should we have a regulation, or should we have a permit system? And I'll come back to that shortly with regard to carbon emissions. Should the emissions be taxed? Should they be regulated? Should they be limited by permits that are traded on the market? Well, I've learned in my experience in public policy that when there are fierce debates among different policy instruments, the general correct answer, as well as the practical outcome, is yes, a bit of all of them. Usually, big debates about which tool to deploy reflects the fact that various tools have various roles to play. They have different niches within a complex economy. So the answer is very unlikely to be all pricing or all permits or all regulations. The right answer and the practical outcome is likely to be a mix of all of those scenarios and all of those policy tools. A fifth point that I think is a fairly general point, I mention it because it's a very easy guidepost. We need to get carbon dioxide emissions down dramatically. We know that the energy source that emits the most carbon dioxide per unit of usable energy is coal. Every analysis shows that if we continue to use coal at a large scale, we don't have a chance of achieving the global warming limits set in the Paris Climate Agreement. I think, therefore, a robust statement of principle, number 5, that we can make is that coal should be phased out, and phased out quickly, except when coal is used with carbon capture and storage technologies, which in effect would allow the coal to be used safely with the carbon dioxide put aside. A sixth general principle is to be efficient in how we deploy our tools. For an economist, that means if you have a certain set of objectives, aim to achieve those objectives at the lowest social cost. And that's true with deploying our energy resources as well. We're looking in general for the least cost solutions, whether it's the least cost ways to reduce carbon emissions or if we continue to use fossil fuels and phase them out over decades, to use the lowest cost fossil fuels. There is an implication of that. The low cost world producer of most oil and gas is in the Middle East, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Qatar, other countries of the Middle East. Those are the reserves that, as we phase out large scale use of fossil fuels, are the ones that the world should deploy to be able to get its remaining fossil fuel energy at the lowest cost. Of course, for that to be the case, there has to be a high level of confidence in the world that the Middle East is stable, not at war, able to be a reliable producer, not aiming to create new instabilities or new monopolies that would hinder the long term deployment of those reserves. But I mention this because I think there is a logic for the Middle East oil producers to be the low cost providers, and to take note, because there's a reverse side of that coin, that real solutions are going also to mean that we stop the exploration and development of high cost oil and gas reserves, whether it's in the Arctic Circle or in fragile ecozones or in the ultra deep sea or in places where we just should not be drilling, because those are not low cost solutions. They are not efficient parts of an energy system transformation. The seventh principle: be prepared to strand a lot of the proved reserves of coal, oil, and gas. What does that mean? It means that we cannot safely combust all of the known reserves of our fossil fuels. That's a hard idea to swallow if you happen to be an oil producing country or a coal producing country. Hey, what do you mean we can't use all of our fossil fuels? Well, the whole theme of this course is that we have to move decisively away from these fossil fuels and our dependence on them, precisely because of their side effects. And in this sense, we know that this means not using all that we have. In fact, we're going to have to get to a situation where the only fossil fuels that are used are balanced or offset by carbon capture, use, and storage technologies. Principle number 8: use cross border grids and cross border energy systems. What do I mean by that? I'm a New Yorker. I live in Manhattan. Where can New York City hope to get zero carbon electricity most inexpensively and with high reliability? Well, one place certainly is within New York itself. Wind power is very ample, both onshore and offshore. There certainly is potential already being deployed for some solar energy. But one place where New York City likely will get a large amount of its power generation in the future is from Canada. Our northern neighbor, especially the province of Quebec, has vast hydroelectric power potential. If it develops that power potential and sends the electrons south over high voltage direct current lines to New York City, that could be a wonderful win-win for Canada and the United States. It's a trans-boundary solution. It says don't just look within New York City, certainly, or within New York State, or even within the United States border to find the solutions. This is a general proposition. Anywhere you look in the world, whether it's Canada helping with hydropower in the US Northeast and US Northwest, whether it's the potential to deploy high quality, low cost solar energy from Mexico's northern states for the US Southwest, or whether it's the solar energy of the Mediterranean basin countries like Greece that could be sent north to the northern European countries that could really deploy a lot of that sunshine coming from the Mediterranean basin, or from North Africa sent across the Mediterranean into Europe. Solutions for low cost, zero carbon energy systems will be trans border. The ninth principle that I would like to emphasize is directed technological change. Often we think of technology a little bit like the process of evolution, that experiments happen, changes are made, sometimes just serendipitously something is discovered, and a new technology is born, and that starts pulling the economy in one direction or another. But with human made evolution of our technologies and our economies, these can often be directed. In other words, we can say we need to improve the performance of our semiconductors in order to prolong Moore's Law. We need to develop a vaccine against a new disease, or we need to develop low cost, low emission energy systems. And so we direct our technology development capacities, whether in the universities or in the national laboratories, towards certain known goals, not evolving by market forces alone or by seeking new discoveries or profit, but rather by government and business and academia and the philanthropic sector saying, we better figure out how to do something. And that's what's called directed technological change. And I will be coming back to that in more depth. The 10th principle that I would like to emphasize is fairness. Fairness is a principle for the design of public policy. It means that people are treated justly, that different regions are treated fairly. I'll come back to define what is meant by fairness, but economists often put side by side two big principles. One is efficiency. Do what you have to do at the lowest cost possible to do it, using the lowest cost of social resources. And second, do it fairly. And putting efficiency and equity, as we sometimes say, or efficiency and fairness together, creates an overarching set of principles. Sometimes the lowest cost way to do something is to privilege one place over another. And that may not seem very fair if one place gets all the benefits and the other place doesn't produce. So, what fairness says is do what you need to do at the lowest cost, but then have some added transfer payments to equalize the burden in a just way. Perhaps we say to some developing countries, you're really the low cost solution. And the poor countries say, but why should we be the solution? You're the rich countries. Why don't you do that? And then what fairness would say is, well, from an efficiency point of view, you have the lowest cost solution, but we'll help you to pay for it, or we'll pay for all of it, or we'll make a transfer payment to you to make sure that you're not bearing an unfair share of the burden. So, in broad principle terms, efficiency and equity always need to be teamed together. This brings me to an 11th principle, and that is that we do need foreign assistance, or in its technical jargon, official development aid, ODA, in order to help the poorest countries face the climate challenge. I'm going to be talking about that in a bit in detail, but the rich countries have promised climate financing. They promised $100 billion per year as of 2020, and then an amount that is almost surely going to have to rise above $100 billion a year after 2020. So ODA, or official development assistance or official development aid, has to be part of our policy framework. It's a core principle, especially for the poorer countries in the world. And the last point that I want to mention, my 12th principle, is intergenerational equity. This means treating generations, treating us today and the future generations of our children, our children's children, and following generations in a fair way. Generational or intergenerational equity is a fundamental part of sustainable development. And indeed, one of the great motivations of stopping the greenhouse gas emissions precisely is not to help the current generation, but to help the future generations to have a habitable, safe, prosperous planet. So intergenerational equity is built right into the fabric of sustainable development in the Paris Climate Agreement. But it's a bit complicated. The current generation, us, we need to make action. We need to take steps in order to protect the well-being of the future. We need to be stewards of the planet and stewards of later generations. But it doesn't mean that the future generations have no responsibility. They actually are going to have to even pay for some of the things that our generation today is doing. Well, how can the future pay for what we are doing today? The answer is through what's sometimes called intergenerational fiscal policy, or to be a little bit more straightforward, government debt. Because if the government's going to make investments today for the benefit of the future generations, one thing the government can do is to say, we'll raise the revenues today, not by taxing the current generation, but by borrowing and then taxing later generations in order to service or pay off that public debt that is incurred currently. Well, one can show in a detailed economic analysis that it's possible to shift some of the financing responsibilities through public financial methods like public debt across time so that future generations get the benefits of mitigation actions, but they also bear some of the costs in a fair way. So intergenerational equity means being fair to the future, but also to the present, that the burdens and responsibilities and financing costs are borne across time, across generations, in a responsible and equitable manner. Well, these are 12 principles that I think both show we have a complex challenge on our hands. Second, that public policy doesn't come neatly packaged as one simple solution. And three, that we better define the principles of good public policy as we move forward in order to implement a low emissions strategy.